This is Groundeffected. My name is your dad, and today I'm painting a massive space marine. I'm stuck. Now, I've painted my fair share of little space robot men in the past, but none quite so large as this one. I also just want to say before we start the video that this video was sponsored by Bulkmancers. More about that later. So of these two models, one of them is painted with an airbrush, and the other is painted with just a brush on its own. The one on the right is the one with the brush, and the one on the left is an airbrush. Now, there's absolutely no ways I'm going to be brush painting a statue of this size, because I am not actually crazy. But before we get started, I wanted to show you some of the details of this model in its printed form. This is after I've already prepared it. So yes, I've sanded off some of the voxel lines, as you can see and tell by the evidence of the dust that is everywhere. I did have one very small little failure on the base, which I just filled up with some green stuff, and we will carry on as if nothing ever happened. Now, there is enough footage of grown men spray painting primer onto models on the internet, so I'm not going to add any more to that in this video, and we'll come back when I've got this model prepared and ready to start painting. I also printed a clear version of the helmet to put some lights in. I think there's going to be a hole in the table afterwards. Feels like, dude, why does it feel like, is that even legal? This is legal. Now it won't be held in place. I think I've just ruined everything, including my dreams and my life. I think that, to be honest, we should just get back into painting this model. And the first steps in painting this dude after the primer layers are on is to give it a zenithal layer, and this is where you add white ink or paint over the top of black in the shape of the light that is hitting your model. At this point, all I'm doing is focusing on how the highlights are going to rest on the surface of my statue, and I'm gonna make sure that things that are prominent, like for example his shoulders and knees and any shiny areas, are going to stand out and nice and proud. And once that ink is dry, I'm going to then add a layer of a clear lacquer, which is a protection layer for the things that I'm going to do to this model later on. And while I wait for that to dry, I can work on his little cover for his pee-pee in front and the bum-bum at the back, because all Space Marines have to have this little cloth, and that is because they need it to wipe their hands and faces after eating their cupcakes after a long day of battle with some alien space thing, whatever. I'm going to use some washes to add some depth over that black. This is going to tint that black and give the illusion that it is tinted. So now I have got this model dried, because it is now the next day, complete whole new day, which means that the surface is dry enough for me to do the crazy thing that I'm about to do. To be honest, it's not actually that crazy, and the reality is this is one of the videos I've wanted to make for so long, because I've always said that painting something this small costs you so much less in paint, in time, in all sorts of things, truthfully, but you can learn the same techniques on this thing as you can on this one. And this next technique I picked up from a guy called El Miniaturista, who is an incredible miniature painter, and this is to use a oil and white spirit to make the crevasses a little bit deeper and darker before we even put the layers of color on top. And had I not even considered thinking about looking at that miniature painter's work, because I thought that his technique wouldn't be able to be suitable for larger models, I would never have known this trick. What I've done is cut a cup, a little plastic cup, and this is going to be my vessel. Sometimes I would use a little bit of a smaller ink cap or something like that, but this is a large model, so I'm going to need quite a fair amount of this stuff to put on this model. But first we should take it apart so that this makes it easier for us to handle these pieces bit by bit. Do you remember that clear helmet that was being cured and that I was preparing for this, well, I have put LEDs onto the inside of it, and they are going straight to those eyeballs, and I have masked off the eyeballs, and I've prepared it with the primer, and then now I just need to make it look like that, and then put a gloss clear on so that this can be done at the same time as this, so that everything matches, because matching is the thing. This video was sponsored by Bulkmancer Sculpts. This is a Patreon over on Patreon where you get up to 15 models a month that you can 3D print for yourself. These models come in 1/8 scale, and some of these sculpts are absolutely amazing. If you have a look at what they've got available for the last month, you might be tempted into joining this Patreon, and if you are, there will be a link for them in the description. And I want to say a special thank you to Bulkmancer for sponsoring this video. Now, of course, the model in the video was made by Bulkmancer, and this model is no longer available. Unless you join their Patreon, there might be a way. I'm not going to say too much more, but have a look at their link in the description. Now, when it comes to choosing the right oils for this application, I'm going to be totally honest with you. At first, I mixed up a lamp black, which ended up being very bitty and lots of tiny little and it was horrible. So the truth is, I then mixed up ivory black, which ended up being way less bitty. So I feel like it's going to depend on the quality of paint that you buy, as well as the type of color. I don't really know, but for me, in this particular paint series, the ivory black was way better and smoother than the lamp black. So if you are going to buy yourself an oil paint, maybe perhaps look for the ivory black over lamp. I don't know if that is a real thing, but this is a thing that I figured out for myself, and so whatever. Moving on to what we're going to do with that. We're going to add a load of thinners with that. This is a white spirit, which is an artist white spirit, and this essentially breaks down the paint and makes it into a wash. I can then put that into all the crevasses and then let it dry, and because we have laid down that shiny layer at first, we can come back and buff off everything outside of those crevasses, and we can also use that white spirit to help us remove some of it if it's being a bit stubborn, but in theory it's pretty simple to do. I then use my hairdryer that I definitely didn't steal from my wife at all, and I dry all these parts so that I can then get ready for the next layers. Now, these next layers are going on top of a gloss coat, so be careful. If you spray them thick and wet, it's going to pool up and be horrible. You want to spray them in very thin layers, building up the color at first. At least you want to just spray down a very thin layer in order to matte the surface, and then once that layer is dried, you can go to town with thick layers over the top of that, because it will stick down nicely and not pool up. But if you spray a thick layer over the top of your glass, you're going to have a bad time. After you've got what I like to call the highlight color down, it is a nice surface for you to start working on adding the shadows. And for the shadows, all you want to do is tint the shadows, the color of the shadow that would be on the surface. Now, in this case, it is a blue, so black would be stupid to use as a shadow, because black is not the shadows of blue. Dark blue is, and I used a ink in order to tint all the black to a dark blue, which gave me some nice shadows. While that's drying on the side, I can take some deck tan and spray the scrolls that all these Space Marines have across them. Also, I'm going to use a matte paint, which is clear paint, to go over the top of everything at the end of that, just to make sure everything is nice and matte. For his base, I'm going to use a brown sprayed over the leftover remnants of the zenithal highlight in order to create a little bit more color underneath the grays that I'm going to dry brush over the top of this rock-like base. And I'm going to do a gray at first and then use a deck tan just to catch some of the edges, so that that helps to create the depth of all the textures that are on the base. When I'm done with that, I'm going to take a wash and I'm going to spray that into the shadows, or just areas around the creases, and separate portions of the rocks to make it look a little bit more like there is some depth. And then I'm going to do the classic thing of paint my rim black, because if you don't paint your rim black, are you even modeling at all? And now that our Space Boy armor is all dry, it's time for us to start adding the details to that armor. And by details, what I'm going to do is just add some silver. This is a very nice silver from Ammo by Mig. I really like the silver for silver things. And I'm going to paint that into some of the little robot-y bits that are on his body. If you tell me it's not a robot, I don't care, because it literally looks like a robot. I know it's a suit, but Iron Man looks like a robot, even though he's not a robot. Anyway, let's just move on to the silly patty stuff, which I have been mentioned about multiple times in my comments to use. And this is a classic example of using something like this. You can see me using the putty to protect the immediate edge, but my hand is helping to protect the rest of the model. The one thing about this putty is that it starts to move over time, so you do have to be careful. I took some blue and painted over the Omega sign on his kneecap, because that's what they look like in real life. I'm going to use some of this contrast spray into the shadows to just try and help push a little bit more detail into the model. Now, this is a part where I'd masked off using some tape, knowing full and well that this putty is going to move over time, and I placed the putty over the areas that are excess, meaning I didn't need to use any more tape. The tape was just for the sharp areas. On his helmet, I sprayed a white, but technically it was deck tan at first, so that my red that I sprayed over the top was nice and vibrant. Once that red was fully dried, I masked down the center of it again to keep the red in place, and I painted deck tan back on it again so that we had the white stripes over the top of his helmet. These are his racing stripes, which help him move faster in battle. I then removed all of the masking to check if I had cocked this up completely, and luckily for me, I hadn't. So I moved on to adding the trimming onto the helmet, which meant putting some silver around the little vents on the side, and also painting the edge highlights on this model. Now, when I paint a miniature or a small version of these Ultramarines, I like to use deck tan as my highlight edge. But because this model is so much bigger, the highlight edges are also so much bigger. So for those highlights, I mixed a bit of silver with a little bit of a dark blue, or royal blue in this case, which gave me a sort of bluish silver to add on the highlights. Once I was satisfied with how the helmet was, it was time for me to add the battery holder and put a battery to check the lights. The lights work, so I can move on with my life and carry on painting the rest of the model. This involved painting all the under armor, which is all going to be black, and when I was done with that, I added more trimming on the other parts of the model. And once I am satisfied with the level of trimming on the hips, or whatever you want to call these bit of the body, I can then glue his loincloth on. This is obviously going to help him wipe his hands. We know why. Once that is glued on, I can move on to adding some of the trims on the rest of the feet. I'm not sure why I went in this direction, but this is the direction I went in, even though I should have done the feet first. Don't worry about it. But all of the trimming on this thing is exactly how I would do it on a miniature. However, I might pay a little bit more attention to the miniature's edges because it's so small. You want to bring out some of those highlights. I would never have known or even understood the meaning of doing an edge highlight like this had I never painted a miniature Space Marine in my life. So yesterday I put the model together so I could take photos for my Patreon. If you are even remotely interested in work in progress pictures and behind the scenes stuff, you should check out my Patreon. Now it is time for me to start adding the trimmings on the rest of the model, and these parts are going to be, for example, on the pauldrons. These are the weird little shoulder pads that these dudes wear, and on this guy's pauldron he has a couple of things. There is a red little splat behind a skull, and also a scroll of some kind. So I need to paint these all three things in deck tan, because this is the color that is going to go underneath when I add my shades on later. I'm going to use this time at the same time to paint the gold onto the trimming that goes around the outside of all of the Space Marines that are of the blue variety. When I'm done with that, I'm going to take some ROXY flesh shade and use that to shade that gold, but at the same time I'm going to use it to overspray onto that little bit of scroll that is on the bottom. That color is also going to overspray onto the skull as well, and then when I've finished filling in his eyes and nostrils with some ROXY flesh shade, I'm going to paint this ball red around that outside little star splat thing that is behind the skull of the skeleton on the pauldron. And as you can see, that makes a very nice combination of colors. I'm going to use some of this panel line wash to get into the crevasses of the text that is on his little scrolls that he wears. His little achievement badges need to have the text written on them, but in order to make that stand out, I did dry brush them with some deck tan after I let that panel line wash dry. Similar thing happened on the other pauldron, except this time it was just deck tan over the Omega sign and then the gold trimming. And this time, before I add the ROXY flesh shade, I'm going to add this grey contrast into the shadows of that Omega sign, because that's going to help it look a little bit more detailed. I'm also going to go around the edge with some deck tan to edge highlight that little sign, which is just going to make it look super crispy and epic. And now to move on to his belt of utilities, wearing which he keeps all of his cupcake and cupcake making tools, I'm going to use brown. It's one of the easiest things to do. Just paint all of the satchels brown. For the little bone that he has dangling off of it, I'm going to use gold to dry brush that thing. I'm then going to paint the bones with deck tan, and I'm going to paint in the sides of it with a silver. I'm going to come back to this though later, and I'm going to use a Agrax Earth shade and possibly even some ROXY flesh shade to just shade it a little bit more. I used Cygor brown to paint the belt with Cygor brown, because the belt is supposed to be brown, I guess. I used some silver to do the buckles of all of the little satchels, and this just helps to separate them and make them look like I actually paid some attention. This is the part where I did the silver, like I said, and I used ROXY flesh shade to shade everything around that weird little box of bones that he keeps hanging off of his frickin' belt. Now, taking some Agrax Earthshade, I'm going to spray that onto all the little satchels, because this will help to get the depth back into them, because I just painted them a singular color of brown. Using it this way is easier, because if there is a bit of overspray on the blue, it's not an absolute end of the world, but it helps to get that color into the shadows of those satchels and make them look like you paid more attention. I put the gold onto his Aquila on his chest, and then I used that silver and blue mix that I had made earlier to go around and edge highlight the rest of his torso. This is on everything, including the vents and the cool little collar that they have around their necks, which I'm pretty sure gets in the way of many things. However, moving on to the arms, I painted the under armor with the black like I did with the legs, and then I also painted the edge highlights for the rest of the arms, and this was done with the exact same silver and blue that I used on the torso, the legs, the pants, the everything, literally the everything. I used some Tesseract Glow on one of the little buttons that's on his arm, because I feel like this would probably be a light of some kind, and then I moved on to painting the chains around his arm, and this I just used silver. That's that Ammo by Mig silver, and it paints really, really well. And when I was done with that, I finished off the edge highlights on that arm. And obviously, now that that is done, I can add some shades by using this Griff Charger Grey sprayed into the bottom parts of those chains. I then took the same silver and dried my brush as much as possible and painted that over the top of the black portions that I left on the weapon that is in his hand. I also used some of that silver to embellish some of the little raised pieces that are on the gat to make it seem like it is more GAT-like. When I was done with all of that, I then used some panel line wash. I shake it up before I use it because sometimes those pigments seem to settle at the bottom, and this helps to make it a little bit darker if it is running a little bit thin. I then used that over every single part of the black parts of the weapon in order to make it look not so shiny, because it doesn't look so great if it's too shiny. I then used some decals that I have from some older models to add onto the weapon itself, because I wanted to make it look just that little bit more authentic. I then moved on to the backpack, and the backpack of this character is pretty simple. It's mostly just painting the edges of the freaking air vents, whatever they are, on the back of their backpack, and then painting some of the trimming around the outside of that little circle in the center, and then painting the skull in gold on the back. There is also another Omega sign here, because these guys clearly need to make sure that you know where they're coming from when they kick your ass. Moving on to his other weapon, which is a massive hammer of some kind, I'm going to use a dark silver to frame the area where this little bird is on the side of the hammer. I'm also going to take my time to quickly do the edge highlights around the hand and stuff like that, also on the excess blue that I left on the bottom of the weapon. Now, of course, I think in the reference pictures this whole entire hammer is a different color, but when I paint one of these guys, same with the gat in his hand, I like to leave some of that blue over, because obviously they would like to have their weapon painted. At least that's what I think, in my opinion. I used the same techniques for painting the rest of the weapon that I did with everything else on the trimming of the model. It was then time for me to move on to painting the portrait, and I'm going to start out with Pinkle on this face. Now, as you can tell, the one side of the face is a little bit lighter than the other, and this is going to help with the depth and make it seem a little bit more realistic that the shadows are actually there. Once I was done and let that Pinkle dry, I started out with a darker brown skin tone. This is to set up for the rose kind of color that I'm going to spray over the top of that, helping to build up the value of the skin and keeping as much saturation amongst all the colors that are going to be overlaid on top of each other. Speaking of saturation, using skin tones, they tend to have a lot of white in them, which desaturates the color. So using Orcish Dermis, I can bring that saturation back in. Once I have done building up all of the colors that I want, and I have got the value that I need in the color, I'm going to take some Reikland Flesh Shade and shade that into the crevasses underneath his chin and around the sides of his head to just help sell the effect that it is darker and deeper than what it actually is in real life. Now, if it was a female character, I wouldn't necessarily use the Reikland Flesh Shade for this, but because it's a male character, this helps to create that grit that we need for man skin. Now, in this guy's entire life of fighting aliens and eating cupcakes, he has got a lot of scars and battle wounds across his face. So I painted those with Magos Purple in order to make them appear like they're a little bit angrier than what they actually are. I then took some dark silver to paint his awesome studs on the side of his head, and then used some Sagor Brown to paint his eyebrows, as well as to paint the insides of his eyes to set them up for painting the white parts, which we all know is called the sclera. I'm going to take some Griff Charger Grey on a very low pressure in my airbrush and spray this around his chin to create an after 5 o'clock shadow to make it look like there is some hairs that he has just shaved. I don't know. This makes it look more manly, put it that way. I'm going to use some highlight skin to paint the inside whites of his eyes and shape up the eyes as best as I can, right meow. And when that's done, I'm going to use some royal blue to shape out the irises of his eyes. This is going to be the outside main shape of the iris. I'm going to make sure these are straight and in the center and as round as I possibly can make them. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to take a little bit of a brighter blue in the form of this deep sky blue and paint that just into the center of those pieces, leaving a very thin rim of dark blue around the edge. I then take a very small brush with a bit of black on to create the pupils, and when I'm done with that, I will then put a highlight, which is a specular highlight using the highlight skin, on the top right hand corner and a small one on the bottom left. I then took Magos Purple to paint underneath the lids and called this model done.
3D tentacles.
I hope that for some reason this video gave you some insight into painting, whether it be figuring out that you can paint small things to figure out how to paint big things, or whether it just be you learned how to dry brush a rock. Either way, I hope that this video gave you at least a little bit of inspiration and helped you with your own journey in painting and 3D printing and all the rest of this hobby. I am at the point of the video where I want to say a very special thank you to those who support my channel, as well as those over on Patreon, because without them I could not be able to make videos every single week. And I want to say a special thank you to those who support me over on Patreon. If you want extra content, additional work in progress pictures, as well as some extra stuff that I'm working on in the background, then Patreon is the place for you. Also, please go and check out the sponsors of this video, because also without their support, these videos probably would also not be able to happen. Thank you so much for watching my video, and if you did not enjoy anything in this video, then realistically I actually don't care, and you probably should have done this earlier, but I'll tell you to do it anyway, and you should now f*** off.